Hello and welcome to Eastern Roman history. After the Great Persian War and the rise of Islam in the early 7th century AD, which saw significant portions of the late Roman Empire fall to foreign attack, the fallout of these political, military, economic, social and cultural changes shook the Eastern Roman Empire. The system and society that had been established by Diocletian and Constantine after the 3rd century crisis was now no longer suited to the empire's reduced circumstances. Cities shrank. Villages and coastlines were constantly harassed by ravaging raids. Learning and education declined, and monetary transactions became significantly reduced. While these years have been traditionally called the Dark Ages, more recently called a transformation, and presently the early Middle Ages, daily life changed significantly from what it had been during antiquity. For the ordinary person, an earthquake could leave their home in ruins and loved ones buried under rubble. The bubonic plague, which continued to rage until 748 in the Eastern Roman Empire, could wipe out whole families and leave cities such as Constantinople deserted. As well as natural disasters, the era was marked by constant warfare, including rebellions and the major religious upheavals of monothelitism and iconoclasm. The empire was beset by the Lombards in Italy, the Bulgars and Slavs in Thrace, and the Saracens in Africa, Anatolia, and the Aegean Sea. Should a village be destroyed or city sacked, the population might be massacred or led away as slaves, with little chance of seeing their families or homes again. The survivors would be left with charred houses, missing loved ones, defiled womenfolk, and the ensigns of the world in ruins. The prayers they offered to holy icons for deliverance fell on deaf ears. When Constantinople was besieged in AD 717, many thought that the end of the world had come. However, during the era of the Eastern Roman Empire's daily fight for survival, life went on. This video shall take an introductory look at some aspects of daily life during these troubled times. Society. Life in the countryside revolved around the village community. The most basic economic unit in the government's eyes was the village community, and that is how it organised its system of taxation, which Constans II turned into a half-tax and also a land assessment. After the decline of the great land holdings prevalent in the late Roman Empire, a significant portion of the land in the empire was owned by free soldier farmers. In addition to the church and the aristocracy, these village communities contained a variety of social strata: freemen, slaves, freedmen, and paroikoi. Freemen were full Roman citizens. Paroikoi were dependent peasants, similar to a serf or a villein, and were the successors of the late Roman colony. A freedman was a citizen who had been manumitted from slavery. A slave was a person who was considered the property of their master. All of these groups were common throughout the empire. For example, a free soldier farmer might have married a freedwoman, owned a slave or two to help around the house, and had several paroikoi to help work their land. The majority of the people in the empire spoke Greek, although there were many different peoples in the empire, including Syrians, Armenians, Africans, Slavs, and Anatolians. Latin was the common language in areas such as Africa, Sardinia, Italy, and Illyricum, except for Sicily and Calabria, which had a large Greek population. The variety of peoples contained within the empire is reflected in the origin of its emperors. Heraclius and his descendants, as well as Philippicus, were Armenian. Leontius was Isaurian. Tiberius and Theodosius III were from Anatolia. Leo III and his dynasty was Syrian, and Irene was Greek. At court, many official documents, laws, and inscriptions continued to be written in Latin, but Latin was used less and less. The preface of the Ecclesia, the law book of Leo III, explains that one of the reasons for its production was that most people could not read the older Latin law books. Although Latin was still used for official documents and correspondence with the West. Heraclius's use of the title Basileus rather than Imperator Augustus in AD 629 was a turning point in the gradual adoption of Greek as the language of officialdom. Housing. Peasant housing consisted of a simple 1 or 2 room house. What it was made of depended on the area. Cappadocians literally carved their houses into the rock, whereas others built their houses out of wood or stone. Wealthier farmers could afford to have an upstairs, where the lower floor would be turned over to industry and the upper floor for the family. Many families had pets, such as dogs, which would be useful for shepherding and other such roles. Horses were needed for the cavalry, mules for pulling wagons, and oxen for a whole range of tasks, such as ploughing fields. Food and dining. Most Byzantines had 2 main meals, lunch and dinner. Breakfast was quite uncommon as a major meal. In fact, Aetios's medical textbook recommended 1/3 of the day's food to be eaten at lunch and the other 2 at dinner. Meals were eaten with knives, forks, spoons, finger bowls, and napkins. By the 8th century, ordinary people sat at a table to eat their meals. However, for the emperor and Constantinople, it was still customary to eat in the traditional Roman fashion by reclining on a sofa. This practice continued in the imperial court until the 11th century. Some of the things that the Byzantines would eat were cheese and cheese fondue, tuna, fish, leeks, onions, garlic, goat meat, pork, figs, poultry, mutton, soup, bread, jam, possibly even sorbet, barley bread, beer, wine, water, chicken, goose, lamb, hogget, beef, pepper, ginger, sugar, salt, herbs, spices, lentils, tripe, ham, stew, apples, melons, dates, raisins, salad, pistachios, asparagus, mushrooms, oil, and much more. A basic Byzantine soup called hagiozoumi, or saint's soup, contained water, onions, and oil. Once fruit ripened, a merchant would place the fruit in jars possibly filled with preservatives and honey to stop them going off. People dressed their food in oil and fish sauce. The fish sauce, called garum, was a popular Roman dressing and continued to be made and eaten by the Byzantines. To make garum, fish guts were placed in a pot with plenty of salt, stirred and left in the sun. This process lasted several months. The liquid extracted from these putrefied fish entrails was the garum sauce and could be mixed with wine, water, or oil. Simeon Seth wrote that it was good for clearing the gut. Byzantines did not eat drowned animals, nor ate with their pets at the table. There were also animals that were not supposed to be eaten because they were seen as dirty. This included lizards, snakes, mice, seagulls, crows, dolphins, bears, flies, jackals, turtles, hedgehogs, beavers, among other creatures. Children. At birth, a new child was washed by the midwife and swaddled in woolen bandages. They remained swaddled for 2 or 3 months. Richer families could employ a wet nurse to tend to them. Children were also baptized within a week of their birth. During the baptism, they would be submerged in a font of holy water 3 times and then carried home with their parents and friends escorting them with lit candles and singing hymns. Babies are believed to have been nourished on barley gruel, honey, and water after they had teethed. Toddlers could eat cereals such as bread and oats, vegetables and fruits, and a small amount of white wine. Meat was generally not eaten by children until they became an adult. Toys included carts and horses, model houses, flutes, balls, tops and hoops, dolls, whistles, and so on. Women. In private life, women could take centre stage. Digenes Acretes the legendary hero always waited for his mother before eating his meal. Wives or mothers would also be responsible for their household when their menfolk were away on campaign and were generally vital parts of the household anyway. They were not allowed to appear in processions, and, if their husbands were entertaining male guests, would typically not disturb them. On the other hand, no man, unless they were a member of their family or a eunuch, was allowed to enter a woman's room. Among the upper classes and imperial court, women would generally be waited upon by eunuchs. Women also had to be accompanied by a trusted attendant when they went out. Due to the survival of a number of legal texts and documents, we are well informed about some aspects of daily life that these laws were designed to address. A boy was considered an adult at 15 years old, and for a girl at 13 years. But betrothals for marriage could be arranged for boys and girls aged 7. Marriage between a godparent and godchild was forbidden, as was marriage between close kin, including parents, siblings, and cousins. Marriage had to be consented to by the parents, the bride, and the groom, and a written agreement drawn up. At weddings, invitations were sent to relatives and friends. On the wedding day, the attendants were dressed in white. The groom would be accompanied by musicians to fetch the bride. Brides wore a brocaded gown and embroidered blouse with a veil over their face. As the groom approached, she revealed her face to him, which would have been covered in makeup. They walked together with the wedding party to the church while crowds threw petals over them. In church, their godparents accompanied them to the altar. The godparents held marriage crowns over their godchildren's heads during the ceremony, and the bride and groom would offer each other wedding rings. Afterwards was the marriage banquet. Men and women were placed at separate tables. The family's best dining paraphernalia were used and the tables finally laid. At nightfall, the guests accompanied the newlyweds to their chamber, where they would spend their first night together, and assembled there the following morning to wake them up with songs. A law permitting a wife to divorce her husband if they had not consummated the marriage within 3 years implies that not every wedding night ended in a happy union. Second marriages generally only happened if the original husband or wife died or after a divorce. Third marriages were very rare. A husband could divorce his wife if she committed adultery, conspired against her husband or knew of people that were, and did not tell him, or contracted leprosy. A wife could divorce her husband if they failed to consummate the marriage within 3 years. She could also get a divorce if he conspired against her, or knew of people that were, and did not inform her, or if he was a leper. There were no other grounds for divorce, not even for demonic possession. Under canonical law, it was forbidden to marry between Christian and infidel. However, marriage between Romans and pagan Slavs, as well as Romans and Islamic Arabs, was not unknown. Digenes Akrites, the legendary Byzantine border hero, was himself half-caste. Orphans were looked after by those stipulated in their parents' will, be it written or oral. However, if no will was made, orphans were given to the church or local monastery for guardianship until they were married. An orphan's property was expected to be guarded by their guardian until they came of age, and should not be diminished. Oral wills were supposed to be witnessed by 5 or at minimum 3 other people to give them force of law. The Isaurian Emperor's law book, the Ecloga, updated the commonly used laws of the Justinian Code and factored in biblical law to make a more humane set of laws for everyday life. For example, theft was punished by the offender paying twice the value of the stolen item. If they could not, then they were to be beaten and exiled. If that thief did it again, then they would have their hand cut off. Treason and desertion were punished by death. A married man that had sex with his slave had to sell that slave to a new owner. Marrying a godparent was punished by having both parties beaten and their noses cut off. Anyone seducing a girl younger than 13 was to have their nose cut off and half of their property handed over to her. Incest was punished by death, as was homosexuality. Sorcerers and poisoners, conversant with demons, were to be executed, as were murderers and robbers. Con men were to be beaten and exiled. Slanderers were to be punished for the crime they bore false witness to. These are just a few examples of the more humane laws of the Isaurian emperors. Cities. Many people lived in the countryside in this period, as urban populations declined in many cities. The life of the urban poor was still one of destitution and misery, and although people were not allowed to sleep on the streets, there was often no other option. Many of the old facets of urban life remained, such as markets and local entertainments. The year was broken up with various festivals and holidays, such as Easter and Saints' Days. With shrinking cities and building structures closer together, the wide open streets and fora of antiquity were built over to make smaller high streets filled with market stalls and housing. Space was a luxury people could no longer afford. However, some cities, such as Thessalonica and Constantinople, maintained their antique look and large populations. Indeed, new centres of importance, such as the capitals of the Strategia, actually grew in population and size. New neighbours. Since the empire was quite depopulated and much smaller, when a large group such as the Mardiites, the Armenians, the Slavs, or others were resettled into a local area, the entire neighbourhood could have large new communities of occupants. The population of the empire is estimated to have dropped to about 7 million people in this time, and so the introduction of 18,000 Mardiites, 50,000 Armenians, or 200,000 Slavs into an area could result in a significant change in the neighbourhood of a region. These new groups quickly adopted the language and culture of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Slavs quickly assimilated into the empire once settled. Other cultures, such as the Armenians and Mardiites, remained more distinct. Even in the early 9th century, the Mardiites who had been settled over Hellas Strategia, the Aegean and southern coast of Anatolia, remained a distinct group within the empire a century after their settlement. Money. In the 8th century, there were 4 main denominations of coinage. There was the gold solidus, or nomisma as it was now called. This had and would continue to retain its value of 72 nomismata to a pound of gold until the 11th century. A nomisma was equal to 12 miliaresia, or 24 curatia, or 288 folies. The silver miliaresion, introduced by Leo III, replaced the silver hexagram coin introduced by Heraclius. A miliaresion was worth 2 curatia, or 24 folies. The curation was a smaller weight silver coin, half the value of the miliaresion, and was equal to 12 folies. The follis was a bronze coin, and most commonly used in small, day-to-day transactions. Taxes would generally be paid in nomismata, and so it was important for everyone to sell enough of their produce to exchange their miliaresia and folies for nomismata to pay the tax collector. As monetary fines were very low for this period, it is likely that payments in kind and barter were much more common, but taxes were always paid in cash. The economy of the empire was, like almost every other pre-industrial society, an agricultural one. The nomisma amounted to roughly 18 days' wages for a common labourer, and by law, a wealthy man was someone that owned a total wealth of 144 nomismata, or the equivalent to £2 of gold. A town worker typically earned around 15 or 16 folies a day, whereas their rural counterparts earned about 12 folies per day. Since a loaf of bread weighing a pound cost about 1 follis, these earnings would just about see to a man and his household's requirements and pay his taxes, which on average amounted to 1 nomismata per household. In the army, a private soldier has been estimated to have earned around 5 nomismata per year. Junior officers, such as a centrarch, was paid around 30 nomismata, and Termarchs, the senior officers under the Strategos, earned around 216 numismata. The Strategos himself was paid an enormous 2,880 numismata per year. For a private soldier or sailor who had to pay for their own equipment, taxes, and upkeep their families, they were supported by the lands they owned back home, which would be run by their household while they were away. They would generate this money from their household by selling their produce to the local commerciarioi in charge of the local warehouses for supplying and distributing resources to the strategia. The duty of managing the warehouses was eventually taken over by the Protonotarios in roughly AD 800, part of the reform of the strategia into the themes. Education. Most ordinary people in the empire were illiterate, and education sharply declined among those that usually sought an education during this time. The constant need for judges, civil servants and clergymen demanded a stream of educated men, even if they were not numerous, nor to the same standard as earlier or later ages. In general, education started, if you could afford it, at 6 years old. Education was open to both sexes, though mainly men were sent to be educated. First they learned grammar, reading, writing, and studied the classics, as well as related commentaries on the texts they read. The most fundamental and common text studied was Homer. He remained the focal point of study until the end of Byzantine civilization. Once they mastered grammar and Homer, they then learned rhetoric. This could be used in public duties, courts of law, the civil service, and speeches. The Greek Byzantines were taught was not the vernacular Greek spoken at the time, but the ancient Attic Greek of Thucydides' day. Rhetorical texts for study included Demosthenes, Plutarch, Isocrates, and Hermogenes. Additionally, they learned arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music based on classical texts, such as Ptolemy's geography. This would be taught by a tutor in a disciple system. The University of Constantinople closed down during the Dark Ages. However, by the end of the 8th century, interest in science and astronomy had returned. The iconoclast controversy, regardless of the debate itself, required theologians to explore and study various texts in full to support their side of the argument, which in itself encouraged greater learning. The gift of an organ by Constantine V to the Frankish king Pepin the Short demonstrates that arts such as music were still practiced. An extract from Patriarch Nicephorus' short history, chapter 47, provides an anecdote for the continuation, but also dangers, of daily life in the Byzantine Dark Ages. An armoured Bulgar band suddenly fell upon the inhabitants of the Thracian Bosphorus. They killed a great many people, both among the local population and among those who had crossed over by way of Byzantium for the sake of pleasure and recreation. Others they took captive and robbed of much silver and a considerable number of utensils. On their return from there, they devastated many villages in Thrace. After this, the Saracen nation too raided the Roman country, and as they overran many regions, inflicted much damage on men and animals. Please do remember to like and subscribe, and this has been Eastern Roman History.